Count of Monte Cristo stars Jim Caviezel as Edmond Dantes, the poor but ambitious sailor who finds himself betrayed by his best friend, played here by Guy Pearce. Dantes spends over a decade locked away in prison for a crime he didn't commit, before managing to escape and vowing revenge. While there is a lot I enjoy about this movie, there are two rather gaping flaws that keep it from rising too high on my chart. One is that Caviezel is such a bland actor, and even while playing three distinct characters here, the naive innocent, the jaded inmate, and the dashing cavalier, he remains very uncompelling. The second is that the movie is uncertain what it's actually about. It keeps throwing in these half-hearted attempts at an anti-vengeance message, including at the very end, but that's undercut by the fact that, according to what actually happens in this movie, vengeance frickin' rules and gets you everything you want. The conflicting messages keep the film from ever landing on a deeper level and keep it pretty shallow. It is a fun shallow, and the side characters in particular shine, even if our lead does not, but it all feels a little disappointing. Robbery is a pretty straightforward crime drama that follows both a set of criminals planning a bank robbery and the law enforcement officers who are trying to bring them down. This is the third film directed by Peter Yates, and wow, he really wanted to try out all the genres, didn't he? From the sentimental musical Summer Holiday to the absurdist comedy One-Way Pendulum to then this realistic crime story, he didn't seem to want to tie himself down to one style. While that's interesting to me, this movie isn't. There's one scene that stands out where the leader planning the robbery has a confrontation with his wife, and that scene snaps into focus with some really captivating use of color and staging, but all the rest is very typical of everyday crime dramas without much of a unique stamp on it. For some folks, that's going to draw them right into it. For me, it's going to push me away. I continue to be intrigued by Yates as a director, but this is my least favorite of his films thus far. The Pirate movie is a very loose adaptation of the Pirates of Penzance operetta, incorporating some of the original songs and the general outline of the plot, and interspersing it with original 80s rock tunes. When I went to look this movie up, I learned that people hated it when it came out. It's got like a 9% on Rotten Tomatoes and got a bunch of Razzie nominations, and it's definitely cheesy and silly, but I had a good enough time with it. I was pleased that at least some pieces of the original Penzance tunes showed up, and although none of the rock replacements were much good, they worked just fine if I thought of them as generic background soundtrack tunes. The jokes and one-liners come fast here, and like with any film with large quantities of jokes, some land and some don't, but the ones that don't aren't belabored, just quietly scooted past. I was particularly impressed with a long, farcical sword fighting scene that could easily have gotten boring, but instead kept finding new ways to play with the concept. Will I watch it again? Well, maybe not when the filmed version of the original starring Kevin Kline is right there, but I'm glad I got to see this weird little movie. Liliom is a 1930 movie that I recognized partway through as being based on the same story as the musical Carousel. A young naive woman marries a carnival barker who is abusive and irresponsible, and when he dies committing a crime, he asks to come back to Earth to see the daughter he never met. Carousel at least has some pretty tunes, but this plot is just straight up garbage, happily defending physical violence as some sort of misappropriated form of affection, and it's horrifying. You can't garner any sympathy for these characters at all. The most interesting part of this was the strange afterlife section in the final 20 minutes, which has some suddenly creative cinematic choices, from the visualization of the train to the afterlife, to the introduction of the various characters and how they passed away. I'd much rather have seen a whole movie of that than the domestic abuse apologetics taking up most of the film. Forever Young stars Mel Gibson as a test pilot in the 1930s, who agrees to be part of his friend's top-secret cryogenics research. He expects to be woken up in 1 year, but something goes wrong, and he wakes up in 1992 after young Elijah Wood stumbles upon his abandoned cryotube. I often really connect to sci-fi or fantasy fish-out-of-water stories, body swap stories, accidental time travel, all that kind of thing, but this one never quite sticks the landing, always wanting to go for the cheap sentimentality rather than genuine humanity. Gibson just kind of wanders around here as a general confused nice guy and doesn't get much depth of character. Wood is much better. At this point in his career, he picked up some technique and he outshines Gibson in most scenes. Jamie Lee Curtis as Wood's mother also works very hard to bring something interesting to her thankless role as the nurturing woman who helps everyone else out, but there's only so much you can do with material this thin. It's a fun concept, but this is a pretty flat, schmaltzy interpretation of it. The Expendables is a big, silly action movie following a team of mercenaries trying to overthrow a Latin American dictator. It features a variety of action stars in both prominent and small roles. So hear me out. The movie that I ended up comparing this to in my mind the most was Tick, Tick, Boom. When I finished that movie, I thought to myself, that was one of the most amazing love letters to musical theater I've ever seen, and I have no idea if people who don't love musicals will get anything out of it. This movie feels 100% like a love letter to the big action blockbusters of the 80s and 90s, and as such, it almost completely passed me by. The action sequences don't have interesting fight choreography or unique set pieces so much as just a lot of explosions, and there's not really even any half-hearted character development. But every so often, I'd get a glimpse of the film paying tribute to its past favorites, so with this I'm in this weird space of appreciating what it's doing while having absolutely no interest in watching it myself. It's not for me. The Mark of Zorro stars Tyrone Power as the foppish son of the former mayor of the Californian town by day, and the folk hero Zorro fighting corrupt officials by night. This version of the story really relies on the contrast between the two alter egos, and there is a delightful thrill in watching him play his sensitive nobleman act, knowing that he is smarter, stronger, and more ruthless than he's letting on at any point. Power is very charismatic here, and is a lot of fun to watch. I do wish there was a stronger emphasis on either the political aspect of it or the adventure scenes. So much of the story is just watching Power flit about from group to group, and while that's enjoyable, it feels incomplete. It was a fun contrast to The Mask of Zorro, which I watched for the first time earlier this month, and comparing two different approaches to the character almost 60 years apart is kind of fascinating. This one was less exciting, both narratively and visually, but I really enjoyed seeing a more debonair approach to the character. Love, Life, and Goldfish is a Japanese musical film about a young man settling in a new town after a work demotion and perhaps finding love in the process. I really wanted to love this film, but something about it sat just outside my periphery. I'm often drawn to stories about nerdy outcasts trying to figure out love, especially if there are musical numbers to highlight their journey, but I just had such a tough time tracking this character's motivations and interests. The music does most of the emotional heavy lifting here, but I'm sure that would be much improved by seeing their thematic connection to the actual narrative at hand, which doesn't always happen. The goldfish of the title refers to the fact that the main potential love interest works in a store where people can compete to scoop goldfish out of a larger pool into a smaller one, and the goldfish metaphor is definitely visually arresting, but again, it doesn't always land narratively. There may very well be some cultural differences keeping me at a distance here, so this is one I want to go back and retry, because when it works, it really works. Ambulance is a crime thriller about two brothers whose attempted bank robbery goes wrong, leading them to hijack an ambulance as a getaway vehicle with an injured police officer and an EMT inside. This is a Michael Bay film, which more often than not leads to a big no on my part. And I gotta say, I rolled my eyes harder than anything at the characters name-dropping Bay's other movies multiple times. But other than that, I was pleasantly surprised with this one. It's an interesting concept, as the EMT tries to save the police officer's life despite less than ideal circumstances. But what really pushed it into compelling territory was Yahya Abdul-Mateen II and Jake Gyllenhaal as their two male leads. Bay often attempts to convey male camaraderie and friendship in his films, and this is one of his stronger showings, with the love these two characters have for each other shining through as the emotional thread holding the whole thing together. As a thriller, it's also pretty decent, with enough new set pieces and dramatic turns to keep my interest going, but it's surprisingly the relationships that drive the story, and they do well. Anybody's Woman tells the story of a burlesque dancer who spontaneously gets married to a man drinking away his sorrows at his wife's leaving him. When he sobers up in the morning, he's somewhat horrified at what he's done, but they decide to try and make it work. I didn't like Ruth Chatterton much in Sarah and Son, but she's a lot more interesting and relatable here. She's so easy to root for as she keeps trying to improve her situation, but finds her past being constantly flung in her face. And so much of her rejection is thinly veiled as polite societal norms, so when she reacts against the underlying meaning, we totally get it, but also know how badly that's going to go for her. This is one of the few films in my 1930 project that was actually directed by a woman, so it perhaps makes sense that she brings such compassion to this character. While the ending of the film doesn't entirely work for me, it captured my attention more than most of the other melodramas of the time. Weird, the Al Yankovic story, is a parody biopic of comedy musician Weird Al Yankovic, best known for his goofy parodies of popular tunes. This version stars Daniel Radcliffe as Yankovic, and we follow him on his journey to become one of the most successful pop stars in the world. Of course, most of what is shown in the movie never happened, and is playing off of other well-known biopics that focus on self-destructive rock stars brought down by drugs, sex, and scandals. There are quite a few laugh-out-loud moments in this film, and it doesn't always take the obvious route to them, which is fun. Radcliffe is great in the role, as is Evan Rachel Wood in her role as Madonna. Despite that, some of the pacing of the comedy feels off. There are too many scenes that could easily be straightforward scenes from another biopic, and the only joke present in them is that they're about Weird Al now, and that sole joke isn't enough to carry an entire movie, and as a result there are some moments that drag. But the moments that shine bright, and the ending tied it all together very satisfyingly. Mutiny on the Bounty is a 1962 film about a British Navy crew on an agricultural expedition who are driven to mutiny by their cruel captain. Note that even though the plot of the movie is in the title, the idea of mutiny doesn't truly come to fruition until a good 2/3 of the way through the movie, as most of it is setting the stage for the uprising. This version of the story casts Trevor Howard as the ruthless Captain Bligh and Marlon Brando as his second-in-command. This movie is nearly 3 hours long, and while I appreciate the dedication to plenty of setup, there is easily a full hour of this movie that could have been cut without losing anything at all. The exoticized portrayals of the island of Tahiti take up entirely too much screen time. What I did appreciate was Brando's performance, to which he brings a thoughtfulness and really highlights the struggle within him to respect the procedures in place, but also to protect his men. Those moments were the most interesting for me to watch, and they were what helped the movie ultimately land. A bloated story, but there's definitely some substance to this portrayal as well. Umberto D is an Italian film by Vittorio De Sica about an elderly man who finds himself and his dog being kicked out of their apartment for being behind in rent payments. We watch Umberto try various ways of raising money or finding new solutions, but everything seems to end badly. This is the kind of film that I wouldn't have expected myself to like, a slow meditative look at one man's quiet despair, but it works for me. I think part of what I appreciate so much about it is how well it sets up all these little details that don't pay off until later on. The first half of the film shows the man just going about his daily life, and then when things start going especially badly, we see the smaller signs of all those little things falling apart. Despite being such a sad narrative, it actually ends with a much more hopeful tone than I'd have expected, and that also went a long way for me toward feeling like I got something out of the movie. This was a surprising gem that I found powerful and moving, and I'm very glad that I finally got to it. Scaramouche is a 1952 film about a young Frenchman who embarks on a quest to avenge his friend's death, along the way finding his lost family, joining a theater troupe, and becoming a master swordsman. I'm kind of astonished that this movie isn't better known because it is delightful. It jumps full on into swashbuckling adventure, creating a roguish protagonist who certainly has his flaws, but nevertheless is easy to root for, and the various settings it puts in place for his adventures are so much fun. I particularly love the 8-minute final sword fight that takes place all over a theater, including on top of the opera box railings with audience members sitting right next to them. I also appreciated how much time this movie spent just showing off commedia dell'arte and the various characters and tropes that made it so successful. There are definitely some dated elements to this movie, but it seems so thoroughly of its time that they didn't strike me as out of place, and the good definitely outweighs the bad. This is definitely one I plan to revisit again someday. Space Pirate Captain Harlock is a 2013 Japanese anime about a future world in which humanity set out to look for new homes in outer space, but find Earth blocked off to them when they try to return. I do very much like the visual design in this movie. The pirate ship in particular is just delightfully swashbuckly, and it has some very fun dramatic escape sequences. There are also some interesting plot twists that add good layers to the story. However, most of the story didn't work for me all that much. Neither our antagonist nor our protagonist are that interesting, and it feels like so many of the side characters that could have stood out just got glossed over. I do wonder how these character flaws might be righted in the manga or the anime where they could have more time to explore them. This 2-hour version could only really focus on the world building, and the story's slightly too complicated plot kept bringing in MacGuffins to fix the previous problem. So while it has promise, it falls a little short of delivering on that promise.